Bullets screamed past her ears. Smoke choked the room, thick and acrid, making her eyes water and her throat burn. Screams of wounded soldiers echoed through the shattered walls like a chorus of despair, each cry piercing her heart. Somewhere beneath the rubble, she could hear a young man calling for his mother, his voice trembling with pain and fear. Betty Wilson didn't hesitate, not for a second. She sprinted toward the sound, her uniform clinging to her skin. Dirt and blood streaked across her face, her hands trembling, but her resolve unshakable. Every step could mean death, but she had learned something in training that no lecture or drill could teach. Hesitation kills, and there were too many lives at stake to wait. By the end of that day, history would remember a single act, one daring move that saved 237 soldiers. But in this moment, she was simply a young nurse in a war-torn hospital, fighting against the impossible. She tightened her grip on the stretcher she carried, nodding silently to the other nurses as they scrambled around her. They all knew the risks, they all feared for their lives, but only she seemed calm, focused, as if the chaos itself had no power over her. Memories of home flashed through her mind as she moved. The small streets of her hometown, the way her mother's hand smelled of fresh bread and soap, the quiet Sunday afternoons when nothing could touch her world. That world seemed impossibly distant now, replaced by a reality that was raw, bloody, and relentless. Yet that memory fueled her courage. She wasn't just saving soldiers, she was preserving something sacred, something bigger than herself. The field hospital had been hit by a barrage of shells just hours before. The building shook with each impact, dust raining from the ceiling, plaster crumbling under the relentless assault. Nurses moved like shadows, shouting orders over the din, dragging the injured from shattered rooms to safer corridors. But for Betty, there was no corridor safe enough for hesitation. Every patient mattered. Every life counted. She knelt beside a young corporal whose leg had been mangled by shrapnel. His eyes were wide, panic-stricken. I'm going to die, aren't I?" he stammered. Betty's voice was calm but firm, steadying him. "No, not while I'm here. Not today." She worked quickly, wrapping bandages with hands that shook only slightly, her mind racing with calculations. Every second mattered. Every choice could mean life or death. And then she saw it, a part of the building collapsing under the bombardment. The fire spreading quickly, flames licking the walls, smoke curling toward the ceiling. More soldiers were trapped inside, screaming for help. She could have waited for reinforcements. She could have let someone else risk it, but waiting wasn't in her nature. She grabbed two medics and charged toward the smoke, shouting instructions over the roar of the explosions. Dust and embers stung her eyes, but she didn't stop. She crawled over fallen beams, pulled a soldier from the wreckage, and dragged him to safety. One by one, she moved through the chaos, a force of will and determination, seemingly untouchable by fear. Hours blurred together. The screams, the smoke, the blood. It all became a rhythm, a terrifying dance she moved through with precision. And yet, amidst the horror, there was a strange clarity. Betty could see who needed her most, prioritize the gravely injured, and make split-second decisions that saved lives. She became a storm of action, relentless and fearless. By the time the bombardment finally subsided, she had carried, lifted, treated, and triaged hundreds of soldiers. 237 lives had been preserved by her hands, her courage, her refusal to give in to fear. She sank against a wall, her body shaking from exhaustion, tears mixing with the grime on her face. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a survivor. And yet, in that moment, she became so much more. Her fellow nurses gathered around her, some weeping, some silent, all aware that what she had done transcended duty. "Betty, how did you?" one whispered, unable to finish. She shook her head, exhausted and breathless. "I just did what had to be done." But everyone knew it was more than that. It was courage. It was defiance. It was a single, bold move that defied death itself. As the sun began to rise over the battlefield, illuminating the ruined hospital in shades of orange and gray, Betty looked at the soldiers she had saved. Their faces were pale, exhausted, yet alive. For a moment, amidst the devastation, there was a fragile sense of hope. She had stared into the face of chaos and walked through it unbroken. And though she didn't yet know it, that day would mark the beginning of a legend. Soldiers would tell stories of the nurse who risked everything, who ran through fire and rubble to save hundreds of lives. Families would forever be grateful for her bravery. History would remember her. But Betty Wilson, she simply moved on to the next patient, her resolve unchanged, her heart focused on the work still ahead. Bullets still echoed in the distance, a grim reminder that the battlefield showed no mercy. Betty Wilson's muscles ached, her lungs burned, but she moved with relentless precision, each step calculated. She could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders. 237 lives depended on her skill, courage, and focus. The adrenaline that had fueled her through the initial chaos had begun to mingle with exhaustion, but she refused to stop. Part of being a nurse on the front lines wasn't just medical skill, it was mental endurance. She had trained for hours, studied anatomy, learned triage procedures, but nothing had prepared her for the raw terror of men screaming, bones shattered, blood everywhere. The textbooks never mentioned the smell of fear mixed with smoke, the sound of shells tearing apart walls, the feeling of helplessness pressing down on your chest. Betty paused for a moment in a relatively safe corridor, leaning against a wall smeared with soot and grime. She closed her eyes, trying to catch a breath, but the memories of home surged through her. Sunday walks with her father, the quiet rhythm of her mother's kitchen, laughter echoing in a sunlit living room. That normalcy felt impossibly distant, almost unreal, but it reminded her why she was here. These soldiers were someone's sons, brothers, fathers. She owed them every ounce of courage she could summon. The first wave of reinforcements arrived, bringing a mix of relief and renewed tension. The new medics moved cautiously, wary of the crumbling walls and the unpredictability of enemy fire. Betty quickly assessed the situation, issuing orders with calm authority. "Get that stretcher over here. Watch that beam. It's unstable. I need a medic with me on the east side, now." Her voice carried no hesitation, only clarity. In chaos, clarity was survival. A young private approached, his face pale, trembling as he held a small bag of medical supplies. "Ma'am, I've never been this close to the front," he admitted, voice barely audible. Betty turned to him, her expression softening for a moment. "No one has," she said quietly, "but we do what we must. Stay close, follow my lead, and you'll make it through." The private nodded, trying to steady his shaking hands. They moved toward a room where trapped soldiers cried out, pinned beneath debris. Betty's heart raced as she saw the extent of the destruction. Walls collapsed, furniture splintered, and flames licking the corners of the room. She knelt, assessing the nearest soldier, who had a deep gash across his shoulder. Time was critical. Every second lost increased the risk of infection, shock, or death. She applied pressure, murmuring reassurance as she worked swiftly. A deafening explosion shook the building, sending dust and rubble raining down. Betty was thrown to the floor but immediately rolled up, her mind sharp despite the impact. She dragged the nearest soldier to safety, then returned for another, repeating the process with relentless determination. The chaos around her blurred, men screaming, walls shaking, smoke thickening, but she moved like a force of nature, unstoppable, untouchable. Hours passed in a surreal rhythm. Betty's body screamed for rest, but she ignored it, focused entirely on saving lives. She alternated between applying emergency medical care, coordinating with other nurses, and navigating through the crumbling structure to rescue the trapped. She became a singular presence of hope amid despair, a living embodiment of courage in the face of overwhelming danger. And through it all, the stories of individual soldiers began to emerge in fragments. A young man clutching a photograph of his wife, another whispering prayers for his family, a third begging for water, unsure if he would live to see the next hour. Betty listened, responded, reassured. She wasn't just administering medicine, she was administering hope, the most critical medicine of all. By evening, the relentless chaos began to subside. The soldiers she had saved were battered, exhausted, yet alive. Betty finally allowed herself a moment to breathe, leaning against a wall as the sunset filtered through broken windows, casting an eerie orange glow over the devastation. She closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of the day settle on her shoulders. She had saved lives, 237 to be exact, but each one carried the imprint of trauma, the reminder of how close death had been. Her fellow nurses approached, expressions a mixture of awe and exhaustion. One reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Betty, you did it. You saved them all." She shook her head, voice quiet but resolute. "We did what we had to do. That's all any of us can do." But deep down, she knew she had done more than anyone could imagine. She had faced death, chaos, and fear, and emerged victorious, not for glory, not for recognition, but for the sacred duty of preserving life. As night fell over the battlefield, Betty Wilson's story was far from over. She had earned a place in history, though she didn't yet realize it. The bravery, the skill, the unwavering courage she displayed that day would ripple through time, inspiring generations of nurses, soldiers, and everyday heroes alike. But for now, she moved through the quieting chaos, tending to the wounded, ready to face whatever challenges the next day would bring. The night brought little relief. The sounds of distant artillery and sporadic gunfire echoed through the shattered landscape, reminding everyone that danger never slept. But inside the makeshift field hospital, Betty Wilson moved like a shadow, tirelessly checking on each soldier, bandaging wounds, administering morphine, and whispering words of reassurance. Sleep was a luxury she could not afford, and exhaustion had no place in her mind while lives still teetered on the edge. Her hands moved with practiced precision, though they shook from fatigue. She had learned long ago that hesitation could be fatal. Each soldier she touched was more than a patient. He was a story, a life that mattered beyond the battlefield. She remembered the young corporal she had rescued earlier, the terror still in his eyes. "You saved me," he had whispered, voice hoarse. Betty had only nodded. "You saved yourself. I just guided you." But deep down she knew the truth. She had risked everything for him. As she worked, Betty couldn't ignore the chaos outside. The hospital had been hit by multiple shellings, walls cracked and unstable, fires smoldering in corners. Nurses whispered about the structural dangers, but Betty pushed on. She navigated through collapsed corridors and smoke-filled rooms, guiding medics and soldiers alike. Every step was a calculated risk, a dance with death she executed without hesitation. Hours turned into an endless blur. The soldiers' screams, the smell of blood and gunpowder, and the unrelenting tension became a constant rhythm she had to follow. Yet, amidst the horror, small victories offered fleeting solace. A soldier who had lost consciousness opened his eyes. Another, on the brink of shock, found comfort in her calm voice. Each life preserved was a triumph, but Betty knew that the true test was yet to come. She paused for a brief moment, leaning against a wall, catching her breath. Her uniform was soaked with sweat, dirt, and blood, and her body screamed for rest. But there was no rest, not yet. She could hear the distant cries of more wounded soldiers trapped outside, awaiting her help. Every second of delay could cost lives, and she refused to let that happen. Betty's mind flashed to her training days, long nights of study, endless drills, and the words of her instructors. "In chaos, find clarity. In fear, find courage. You are the line between life and death." Those lessons had prepared her technically, but nothing could have prepared her emotionally. Nothing could prepare anyone for the raw, unfiltered terror of war. Yet here she was, not paralyzed by fear, but moving through it with a precision and focus that seemed almost superhuman. A medic ran toward her, panic in his eyes. "Ma'am, there's a whole unit trapped in the East Wing. The building is unstable." Betty didn't hesitate. Grab the stretchers, take the supplies, move fast, and stay low. She sprinted ahead, the medic following closely, navigating through rubble and debris. The screams grew louder, and she could see the edge of the east wing beginning to collapse. Every step was a gamble, every second critical. Inside the wing, the devastation was unimaginable. Soldiers were pinned under rubble, fires crackling dangerously close, and smoke stinging every eye. Betty moved methodically, assessing the injured, prioritizing those in critical condition, and lifting debris when necessary. The chaos around her was deafening, but she remained a pillar of focus. Each life she touched was a testament to her unwavering courage. One soldier, barely conscious, looked at her with wide eyes. I thought I was done for," he whispered. Betty's hands were steady, her voice calm. "Not today, not on my watch. You're going to make it." She applied pressure to his wound, stabilized him, and guided him toward safety. That moment, fleeting as it was, became a small victory amid overwhelming destruction. Hours of relentless effort began to take their toll. Her body ached, her muscles screamed, and every nerve in her body was frayed, yet she pressed on. She moved from soldier to soldier, room to room, guiding, lifting, treating, reassuring. The hospital had become a battlefield within a battlefield, and she was its anchor. Her courage was contagious. Even the most terrified medics found strength in her presence. As dawn approached, the chaos finally began to subside. The East Wing had been evacuated, and the soldiers she had saved were moved to safer areas. She collapsed against a wall, gasping for breath, tears mixing with sweat and grime. 237 lives had been preserved through her hands, her courage, her refusal to surrender to fear. Yet even in the aftermath, she did not feel like a hero. She felt like a survivor, and that was enough for her. Around her, nurses and medics whispered in awe. "How did she do it?" one murmured. Betty shook her head weakly. "I just did what had to be done," she replied. But everyone knew it was more than that. It was bravery. It was fearlessness. It was a single woman standing against the chaos of war and emerging as the line between life and death for hundreds of men. As sunlight broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across the war-torn hospital, Betty Wilson's legend began to take shape. Not in medals or ceremonies, not yet, but in the lives she had saved and the hope she had restored. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale, shaky light over the battlefield. But for Betty Wilson, there was no time to rest. The devastation of the previous day still hung heavy in the air, the smell of smoke and blood mixed with the cold morning dew, a harsh reminder that the war never paused. Yet she moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the hospital, every corner, every corridor, every soldier she could find. The wounded were countless, and the chaos was far from over. Shells had left the building unstable, each step a gamble. Nurses whispered warnings about the ceiling beams, about the fire smoldering in the East Wing, but Betty pushed forward. She had learned to see fear as a tool, not a cage. Panic slowed people down, clarity moved them forward. And she had clarity in spades. A medic ran up, panting, clutching a stretcher. "Ma'am, there's another group, trapped in the West Wing. The floor's partially collapsed." Betty didn't hesitate. "Grab what you can carry, follow me, move fast and stay low." Her voice cut through the morning haze like a blade. Without waiting, she sprinted ahead, dodging fallen beams and fire-scorched rubble. Inside the West Wing, the situation was even worse than expected. Smoke poured from the ceiling, thick and choking, flames licking the walls, soldiers pinned beneath debris, some moaning, others screaming in sheer terror. Betty's heart pounded, not with fear, but with focus. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the moment that would demand more than skill or courage. It would demand boldness beyond reason. She dropped to her knees beside a young private whose arm was crushed beneath a splintered beam. His eyes were wide, tears streaking through the dirt on his face. I can't move," he gasped. Betty's hands were steady. "Yes, you can. I'm not letting you die here. Trust me." She positioned herself, counting every muscle, every inch as she lifted and shifted the debris. The beam was heavy, and her arms shook under the strain, but she refused to falter. Hours blurred together. The heat from the fire, the stench of smoke and blood, and the cries of the wounded created a nightmarish symphony that threatened to overwhelm her senses. But she moved like a storm, calm, relentless, unstoppable. Every life she touched was a story, a memory, a future preserved. She whispered to the soldiers words of comfort and courage, refusing to let despair take hold. And then she saw the source of the biggest danger. A large section of the ceiling had cracked, threatening to collapse entirely. Beneath it lay at least a dozen wounded soldiers who had no hope of moving on their own. Time was critical. Waiting for reinforcements would be suicide for them and for anyone trying to help. Betty assessed the risk in a single fluid motion, calculating the safest way to act. She realized what needed to be done, and that she alone had to do it. Her heart raced, but her mind was calm. She looked at the trapped soldiers, their eyes filled with fear, and made a decision. If she hesitated, they would die. If she acted, she might die, but she would save them. That single thought crystallized into resolve. She gripped the edge of the fallen debris, bracing her body, and began moving it inch by inch, calling instructions to nearby medics, coordinating the rescue with precision. Every movement was fraught with danger. The ceiling shifted, a beam cracked, and dust and splinters rained down. Betty's muscles burned, sweat and blood mixing on her skin, yet she pressed on, refusing to let pain or fear dictate her actions. She had become a conduit of courage, a force of life in the midst of destruction. Each soldier she freed added to a chain reaction of hope, a lifeline stretching through the chaos. By midday, she had cleared enough rubble to allow safe passage for the trapped soldiers. One by one, she guided them out, supporting them, whispering encouragement, never pausing for breath. 237 lives now rested on her boldness, on the unthinkable courage she had summoned in the most impossible circumstances. Finally, when the last soldier was pulled from the wreckage, she slumped against a wall, her body trembling from exertion, exhaustion, and relief. Around her, the nurses and medics stared, wide-eyed, struggling to comprehend what they had witnessed. Betty Wilson had done the unimaginable. She had stepped into death's shadow and emerged with hundreds of lives in tow. Yet she didn't feel like a hero. She felt a quiet, simmering awareness of the cost, the toll, and the continued danger. The war was far from over, and tomorrow would bring new challenges, new crises, new moments demanding bravery. But for now, in this fleeting calm, she allowed herself a single thought. She had made a difference. She had been the difference. As sunlight broke fully over the horizon, illuminating the hospital in stark contrast, the orange glow of fire against pale walls, she looked over the faces of the soldiers she had saved. There was exhaustion, yes, and fear lingering in their eyes, but there was also life, preserved against impossible odds. That was her victory. That her quiet triumph. The legend of Betty Wilson, the nurse who saved 237 soldiers with one bold, daring act, was only beginning. And though medals and recognition would come later, the true testament of her courage was in the lives she had fought to protect, in the hope she had restored, in the fear she had transformed into survival. The battlefield was a furnace of chaos. Smoke hung thick in the air, mixing with dust and the metallic tang of blood. Screams of soldiers pierced through the din of distant gunfire and explosions. Betty Wilson's eyes swept the room, assessing, calculating, moving faster than anyone could follow. 237 lives balanced on a knife edge, and she was the only one steady enough to tip the scale toward survival. The moment had arrived. The West Wing ceiling, cracked and unstable, threatened to collapse entirely on a group of trapped soldiers. Fire had begun to creep along the walls, smoke curling dangerously close. Any delay would mean death. Reinforcements were still pinned outside, unable to reach the trapped men. The responsibility rested squarely on her shoulders. Betty's mind sharpened into singular focus. She recalled every lesson, every drill, every terrifying moment of training. Yet nothing could replicate the raw urgency of this instant. Her decision was simple: act or watch hundreds die. Fear existed, of course, but she refused to acknowledge it. Fear was a tool for others. Courage was hers to wield. She gripped a fallen beam, her hands raw and bloodied, and positioned herself under the unstable ceiling. Dust and splinters rained down around her, stinging her eyes and scraping her skin. She shouted instructions to the medics nearby, keeping their panic in check while bidding them to assist in her improvised plan. The soldiers pinned beneath debris looked at her, eyes wide, terror written on every face. "Hold on," she yelled, voice steady, though every muscle in her body screamed in strain. Betty lifted, shifted, and leveraged the debris inch by inch. Her arms burned, her back ached, sweat and grime clinging to her uniform. The ceiling trembled, groaned, threatened to collapse at any misstep. Yet she moved with uncanny precision, a mix of strength, strategy, and sheer willpower. One miscalculation could end everything, but she had no choice but to succeed. As she worked, she whispered to the soldiers, calming them, reassuring them. "You're going to be okay. Trust me, just a little longer." Her voice was a lifeline amidst chaos, anchoring their fear to hope. Every movement, every shift of debris, every command was part of a delicate balance that kept life suspended above death. The medics flanked her, assisting where they could, but Betty bore the brunt of the labor. She lifted a particularly heavy beam with a combination of leverage and sheer determination. Sweat stinging her eyes, lungs burning from exertion. Dust choked her, but she pressed on, inching forward, inch by inch, freeing the first soldier. One by one, the men were pulled from the wreckage. Betty guided them, steadied them, treated their immediate injuries, and urged them towards safer zones within the hospital. The fire crept closer, the ceiling groaned louder, but she moved with relentless determination. 237 lives were in her hands, and nothing, not fear, not fatigue, not the inferno around her, would stop her. The chaos outside became a blur. Shells struck nearby, debris fell, and soldiers called for help from every direction. Yet within the West Wing, Betty became the center of gravity, a calm hurricane of action. She moved tirelessly, lifting, pulling, treating, shouting instructions, stabilizing fractures, applying bandages, and above all, refusing to let panic dictate the outcome. Hours passed in a feverish haze. The men she had saved began to gather in safer corridors, battered and bruised, but alive. Betty, exhausted to the point of trembling, allowed herself a moment to glance at the soldiers she had rescued. Faces pale with terror, eyes wide with shock, yet each one alive, a miracle wrought from courage and boldness. She had stared death in the face and pulled hundreds back from its grip. The other nurses and medics approached, their expressions a mix of awe and disbelief. "Betty, how did you do it?" one whispered, voice trembling. She shook her head, almost unable to speak, her throat raw from shouting and exertion. "I just did what needed to be done." But the truth was undeniable. She had performed an act of heroism that would echo through history. Even as the immediate danger subsided, Betty did not allow herself complacency. She continued to move among the wounded, checking vitals, applying treatments, and coordinating evacuation. Her body screamed for rest, but her mind was still razor-sharp. Every neuron focused on preserving life. The war was far from over, and new crises would come. But she had proven that one person with courage and determination could make an unimaginable difference. By the end of the day, the 237 soldiers were alive, their lives spared by a single audacious act. Betty Wilson, young, exhausted, and resolute, had achieved what few could imagine.
The legend of her bold move was not written in medals or headlines yet. It was written in the blood, sweat, and survival of hundreds of men whose lives would forever bear her imprint. She sank against a wall, trembling, eyes wet from exhaustion, relief, and the sheer weight of what had just transpired. Around her, the field hospital began to quiet. But the echoes of her heroism would resonate far beyond this place, this day, this moment. She had faced impossible odds, defied danger, and emerged victorious. Not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. The story of that day would be told again and again, in whispers, in letters, in memories of soldiers forever grateful. Betty Wilson's bold move had changed the course of hundreds of lives. And though she did not yet realize it, she had become more than a nurse. She had become a symbol of courage, hope, and unyielding humanity in the heart of war.
The echoes of explosions had faded, replaced by a tense, almost surreal quiet. The field hospital, once a chaotic storm of fire, smoke, and screams, now resembled a fragile sanctuary. Yet even in this calm, the aftermath of what Betty Wilson had accomplished weighed heavily. Every inch of the building bore scars from the battle. Every corridor held the scent of smoke and blood, and every soldier she had saved carried traces of fear, pain, and gratitude. Betty leaned against a wall, her body trembling, uniform torn and streaked with grime. The adrenaline that had propelled her through hours of relentless action was fading, leaving exhaustion in its wake. But she could not allow herself the luxury of rest. Not yet. There were still lives to check, injuries to tend to, and reports to prepare. The soldiers were alive, yes, but the work was far from over. Medics and fellow nurses hovered around her, whispering questions, offering water, and placing hands on her shoulder. They spoke of bravery, of courage, of heroism, but Betty barely heard them. The words felt distant, almost irrelevant. To her, this was simply what had to be done. She had acted because she had no other choice, because hesitation would have cost lives. Recognition, praise, or medals were not the motivation. Survival was. Yet word of her bold act began to spread almost immediately. Soldiers whispered among themselves, their voices carrying through the hospital like a ripple. "That nurse, she saved all of us," one said, awe in his voice. "Without her, we'd be dead." Each testimony, each recounting added weight to the legend forming around Betty Wilson. She had become a symbol of courage in a world that seemed to demand fear. But recognition did not come easily. Military bureaucracy moved slowly. Awards required paperwork, and officials often failed to grasp the enormity of her actions. Letters would be sent, reports filed, and meetings arranged, but Betty was uninterested in accolades. She focused on the wounded, tending to their injuries, calming their fears, and ensuring they were stabilized before evacuation. Each life preserved was its own reward. Each grateful glance, a quiet medal she carried in her heart. Even amidst the recognition from those she saved, challenges loomed. Exhaustion gnawed at her body. The mental strain pressed on her mind, and memories of the chaos haunted her in fleeting moments of quiet. Nights were the hardest. When the hospital fell silent, and only the soft groans of the wounded remained, her thoughts returned to the faces of soldiers pinned beneath rubble, the weight of the falling debris, the screams she could not ignore. Sleep was often elusive, replaced by the relentless echo of responsibility. Yet despite the fatigue and trauma, Betty's resolve never wavered. Each morning she rose, brushed the grime from her uniform, and returned to the wounded. She had learned that courage was not a single act, but a constant state of being. Saving lives demanded persistence, patience, and unyielding focus. One heroic act did not end the war. It was merely a spark in the ongoing fight for survival. Her peers began to notice the extraordinary depth of her character.
Other nurses found themselves inspired by her focus and fearlessness. Medics followed her lead with newfound confidence, and soldiers looked to her as a beacon amidst despair. Betty's courage had a ripple effect, touching everyone around her, instilling strength where there had only been fear. And at the end of each grueling day, she would take a moment, rare, fleeting, to simply breathe. The hospital still smelled of smoke and antiseptic. The walls still bore scars of battle, and the soldiers she had saved still carried the echoes of terror. But in that quiet, she allowed herself to feel something almost foreign: pride. Not in recognition or reward, but in knowing she had stood against chaos, had acted when it mattered most, and had changed the fate of hundreds. It was in these moments that she began to understand the gravity of what she had done. The bold move that had saved 237 lives was no longer just an act of necessity, it was a defining point in her life. She realized that courage was contagious, that one person's refusal to yield to fear could alter the course of many lives. And though the war was far from over, she now carried within her an unshakable confidence that she could meet any challenge with resolve, resourcefulness, and the relentless determination that had brought her this far. Betty Wilson's heroism, forged in fire and chaos, was already echoing far beyond the walls of the hospital. Soldiers told their families, medics told their comrades, and whispers of her bravery began to travel up the chain of command. Recognition would follow: official reports, letters, maybe even medals. But for now, the true testament of her courage was alive in every soldier who drew breath, every life spared by her hands. And as the sun set over the battlefield, casting long shadows across broken walls, Betty prepared herself for the challenges ahead. Her body ached, her mind strained, but her spirit was unbroken. The war was far from finished, but she had proven that one person, armed with courage and resolve, could defy impossible odds, and that the ripple of a single bold act could echo far beyond the battlefield.
The days after the bold rescue were not filled with relief, they were heavy with echoes. The battlefield had quieted, but in Betty Wilson's mind, the chaos continued unabated. Every scream, every groan, every crash of rubble played on repeat like a relentless film she could not turn off. Sleep eluded her, and when it came, it was broken, haunted by nightmares of soldiers trapped beneath beams, eyes wide with terror, calling for help she could not always reach fast enough. Her body bore the scars of exhaustion. Muscles ached from lifting, dragging, and holding for hours on end. Her hands, once nimble and precise, were calloused, cracked, and stiff from strain. Yet even as physical pain pressed in, the mental toll weighed heavier. Each memory carried with it a shadow of fear, a whisper of doubt. Did I do enough? Could I have saved more? The questions echoed, unrelenting, even in fleeting moments of rest. Betty found herself startled at sudden noises, the crack of a door, the slam of a crate, flinching as if bullets still flew around her. Everyday sounds became triggers, reminders that the battlefield never truly left her. Fellow nurses and medics noticed the subtle changes: moments of silence, sudden tension, a distant gaze that lingered too long. They whispered among themselves, wary of asking the questions they feared. PTSD was a silent adversary, invisible but insidious, and Betty was confronting it without hesitation, silently determined to endure. Despite the trauma, she returned to her duties each morning with unwavering resolve. Every soldier she treated reminded her of the responsibility she carried. Every injury was a challenge, a puzzle she refused to leave unsolved. She moved with the same precision and focus that had defined her heroic rescue, but now each movement was tempered by the knowledge of fragility, of how quickly life could be lost, even in hands as skilled as hers.
Some nights, when the hospital was quiet, she allowed herself brief reflection. She thought of the men she had saved, the ones who had survived only because she had acted boldly. Letters from soldiers began to arrive, small notes filled with gratitude and awe. "I owe my life to you, Nurse Wilson," one wrote. "I will never forget your courage." Those words were balm to her weary mind, but also a reminder of the heavy responsibility she bore every day. Each life was precious, each action critical, and the burden never truly lifted. Betty also struggled with guilt. Not the guilt of hesitation, she had acted decisively, but the guilt of survival. So many around her had fallen, so many faces haunted her dreams. She questioned whether her efforts had been enough, whether she could have prevented more suffering. That internal battle was relentless, a shadow she carried even as she saved lives with unwavering dedication. Yet within the struggle, she found moments of resilience. A soldier's faint smile, a nod of gratitude, the small victory of stabilizing a critical patient. These moments reminded her why she endured. Courage, she realized, was not just the bold acts in moments of crisis, but also the quiet persistence in the days that followed. Endurance was heroism too, and she embodied it fully. Her peers noticed the difference she made. Nurses who had once been uncertain in their own abilities now looked to her as a model of strength. Medics followed her lead with renewed confidence. Soldiers, once terrified, found hope in her unwavering presence. Betty Wilson had become more than a nurse. She was a pillar, a beacon, and a source of inspiration, even as she fought the invisible battles inside her own mind. And yet, the war continued. New waves of wounded arrived daily, each one a reminder that her fight was far from over. The chaos outside mirrored the turmoil within. Each day demanded courage, endurance, and resolve, and Betty met it with the same unyielding determination that had defined her bold rescue. Through it all, she discovered a deeper truth. Heroism was not a single act, no matter how daring, but the persistent willingness to face fear, to endure pain, and to act for others despite the shadows that haunted her. Every day, every decision, every life she saved become part of that ongoing legacy. And as the night stretched long and silent, she continued, unbroken in spirit, steadfast in duty, carrying within her the quiet strength that would define her life and inspire countless others for generations to come. Weeks had passed since the day of the bold rescue, yet the impact of that moment continued to ripple through the lives of those involved. For Betty Wilson, the battlefield was still a place of chaos and urgency, but now it was also a place of human connection, of quiet gratitude, and of emotional bonds forged under fire. The soldiers she had saved were scattered throughout the hospital and nearby field units, each one recovering, each one alive because of her courage. They sought her out when they could, offering words of thanks, small gifts, or simply a lingering glance that conveyed more than words ever could. Betty, exhausted and often emotionally raw, received each gesture with quiet humility. To her, their survival was the reward. Recognition was secondary. Letters began to arrive, carried by military couriers or delivered by fellow nurses. Handwritten notes, some trembling with emotion, others carefully composed, poured in from soldiers expressing gratitude. "Nurse Wilson, I will never forget your courage. You saved my life that day. I owe you everything," one read. Another, more hesitant, wrote, "I don't know how to thank you, but know that every breath I take carries your bravery with it." Betty carefully folded each letter, reading them in stolen moments between rounds. Each one was a reminder that courage could leave lasting impressions, that a single act of selflessness could resonate far beyond the immediate moment. The bonds she formed were not only of gratitude, but of shared experience. Soldiers confided in her, revealing their fears, their hopes, and the memories that haunted them. Betty listened with patience and compassion, offering advice, comfort, or simply the presence of someone who had endured alongside them. She became a confidant, a trusted figure in a world where trust was fragile and often scarce. During her rounds, she encountered soldiers who had survived the collapse but were still battling pain, both physical and emotional. One young private, his leg badly injured, confessed, "I keep seeing the ceiling fall again. It's like I'm there all over." Betty knelt beside him, gripping his hand. "You're safe now. You made it through. Focus on the next step, not the past. We'll get you through this together." Her voice was steady, calm, infused with authority and empathy. That combination of strength and compassion became her signature, the foundation of the bonds she formed. Occasionally, moments of levity emerged. Soldiers would share stories from home, jokes that barely scraped the surface of humor in such a grim environment, and small victories in recovery. Betty laughed with them, a rare and precious sound, breaking through the pervasive tension. Those shared moments became threads weaving together a fragile but resilient fabric of community amidst the chaos of war. She also began to see long-term impacts of her actions. Soldiers she had saved wrote letters to their families, recounting how the brave young nurse had risked her life for them. Parents, siblings, and spouses expressed gratitude that transcended the battlefield. Betty understood, in these small ripples of recognition, that courage and compassion could travel far, shaping lives in ways she would never fully witness. One afternoon, a small group of recovered soldiers sought her out to visit the hospital, bringing flowers, small gifts, and letters of thanks. Their eyes held a mixture of awe, respect, and lingering trauma. Betty greeted each one with a steady smile, careful not to let her own exhaustion or emotional weight show. They spoke quietly, sharing moments from that fateful day, recounting how her decisions had saved them, and expressing heartfelt gratitude that words could scarcely contain. The emotional weight of these bonds was profound. Betty realized that heroism was not only in the bold acts performed under fire, but also in the lasting connections forged through compassion, empathy, and shared survival. She had entered the chaos as a nurse, a healer, and a guardian. She remained that person, but now she also carried the responsibility of being a living symbol of courage, hope, and humanity for the soldiers whose lives she had saved. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting warm orange light across the hospital grounds, Betty paused to read another letter. Its words, simple yet profound, encapsulated the essence of her journey. "You believed in us when we could not believe in ourselves. You gave us life, hope, and courage. Thank you will never be enough." She folded the letter carefully, letting its message settle in her heart. In that quiet moment, amidst the remnants of battle, Betty understood something crucial. Her story was not just about the heroic act, the chaos, or the bloodshed. It was about the human connections she had nurtured, the lives she had changed, and the hope she had instilled. Those bonds, fragile yet enduring, were a testament to the power of courage and compassion. And as night fell, the hospital still alive with whispers of recovery, Betty Wilson moved through the corridors with renewed purpose. Each life saved, each letter read, each bond formed was another reminder that her actions mattered, not just in that moment, but forever. Word of Betty Wilson's heroism began to ripple beyond the hospital walls, carried by soldiers, medics, and letters that traveled through military channels. Soon, whispers of the young nurse who had saved 237 lives with one bold act reached the ears of commanding officers. Her reputation grew like wildfire, a mix of awe, respect, and disbelief. Yet with recognition came scrutiny, and with scrutiny came challenges she had never anticipated. The military hierarchy, rigid and structured, struggled to comprehend the scale of her courage. Reports were filed, but bureaucratic protocols demanded verification, explanations, and sometimes skepticism. Officers questioned details, numbers, and procedures, sometimes unintentionally undermining the very human heart of her heroism. Betty, young and fiercely independent, bristled at these intrusions, yet she responded with calm precision, knowing that defending her actions was secondary to continuing her mission of saving lives. Despite the formalities, the soldiers she had saved became her advocates. They spoke on her behalf, recounting her courage, decisiveness, and the precise brilliance with which she navigated the chaos. "Without her, we'd all be dead," one officer overheard a recovered soldier say. Another added, "She didn't just save us, she saved our unit, our families, and our hope." These testimonies, heartfelt and unflinching, began to pierce through the skepticism of the chain of command. Meanwhile, the hospital remained a theater of relentless urgency. New casualties arrived daily, each presenting unique challenges. Betty moved through corridors with unbroken focus, her courage tempered by experience and her skill sharpened by crisis. She lifted, stabilized, treated, and reassured with unwavering determination. Her hands moved as if guided by instinct, yet every decision was deliberate, every action calculated to maximize survival. Officers occasionally approached her, balancing respect and authority, asking for explanations of procedures or recounts of the rescue. Betty provided answers with steady clarity, never inflating her role, never diminishing the contributions of her peers. She understood that recognition was fleeting compared to the lives she continued to save. Yet the subtle nods of approval from higher-ups, though quiet, carried profound significance. They signaled that her bold acts were not only witnessed, but respected, even if the world had not yet fully caught up to the magnitude of her courage. Amid the praise and scrutiny, challenges persisted. Resources were scarce, injuries were severe, and the chaos outside never ceased. Betty's mental and physical endurance were tested daily. She encountered situations that demanded split-second decisions. Which soldier to treat first, how to navigate collapsing structures, how to manage panic while maintaining control. Each scenario threatened to overwhelm, but she moved with the same unyielding resolve that had defined her initial heroic act. At times, she felt the weight of expectation pressing on her shoulders. Soldiers looked to her as a symbol of hope, medics followed her guidance with unwavering trust, and commanding officers quietly gauged her performance. Mistakes were not an option. Hesitation was deadly. And yet Betty bore these pressures with quiet grace, understanding that true heroism demanded endurance as much as courage. Small victories continued to bolster her reputation. A soldier she had treated weeks ago returned, walking with strength and gratitude, eyes shining with respect. Moments like these reminded Betty that heroism was not just a single act, but a continuous chain of decisions, actions, and compassion. Each life saved reinforced her purpose, even as the challenges mounted. Her peers, inspired by her determination, began to mirror her courage. Nurses worked with renewed focus, medics moved with confidence, and soldiers adapted to the rhythm she set. Betty's presence became the heartbeat of the hospital, a force that balanced chaos with skill, fear with courage, and despair with hope. As dusk fell over the battlefield, Betty Wilson paused for a rare moment, surveying the hospital and the lives she continued to protect. The recognition from military hierarchy, the whispered awe of soldiers, and the gratitude that poured in letters and smiles, all of it mattered, but only insofar as it fueled her next actions. She understood that the war was far from over, that danger persisted, and the lives in her care demanded nothing less than relentless commitment. In that moment, she reaffirmed an unspoken truth. Heroism was not measured in medals, reports, or titles, but in the unwavering choice to act in the face of overwhelming odds. And for Betty Wilson, every day was an opportunity to embody that truth, to guide, protect, and save lives, and to continue shaping a legacy that would endure far beyond the battlefield.
The war eventually began to recede, its thunderous chaos replaced by tentative calm. But for Betty Wilson, the impact of her actions reverberated far beyond the battlefield. The hospital had stabilized, the soldiers she had saved were recovering, and the reports of her heroism had finally reached the higher echelons of command. Letters of recognition, commendations, and invitations to meet commanding officers began to arrive. Yet, even amidst the formal acknowledgement, her focus remained unchanged. The lives she had saved were her true reward. Word of her bravery spread beyond the military. Newspapers published stories of the young nurse whose courage had defied danger, saved hundreds, and inspired countless others. Betty became a symbol of resilience and selflessness, a beacon in a time defined by uncertainty and fear. Soldiers she had rescued returned to visit, bringing gifts, letters, and stories of how her bold act had shaped not only their survival, but their futures. Each encounter reminded her that heroism left an enduring imprint far greater than medals or ceremonies ever could. Yet recognition did not erase the toll the war had taken on her. Memories of rubble, screams, and blood haunted her, sometimes seeping into quiet moments when she least expected them. Nights remained restless, filled with vivid flashbacks that tested her endurance. But she had learned to confront these shadows with the same determination she had applied on the battlefield. Courage, she realized, was not only about action in a crisis, it was also about facing the unseen battles that lingered long after the chaos ended. Despite the lingering trauma, Betty continued her work in nursing, dedicating herself to care and compassion. She mentored young nurses, teaching them not only medical skills, but also the importance of calm under pressure, decisiveness, and empathy. Her stories, carefully shared, inspired a new generation of medical professionals to understand that heroism could manifest in both bold actions and steadfast dedication over time. The soldiers she had rescued remained a living testament to her courage. They carried her lessons forward, supporting one another, mentoring newer recruits, and recounting the tale of the nurse who had stood against death itself. Each life thriving because of her choices became a thread in a tapestry of enduring impact, proof that one person's bravery could resonate far beyond a single battlefield. Formal recognition eventually arrived. Commendations, medals, and public ceremonies celebrated her daring actions. Yet Betty received them quietly, often redirecting praise toward her fellow medics, nurses, and soldiers. To her, heroism was never solitary, it was a collective effort in which each contribution mattered. She had acted boldly, yes, but she had also relied on teamwork, coordination, and trust, the very elements that made her success possible. In her quieter moments, she reflected on the weight of her experiences. 237 lives had been saved by one bold act, a number she had never anticipated when she first stepped into the collapsing hospital wing. The fear, the exhaustion, and the relentless strain had tested every fiber of her being. Yet in overcoming it, she discovered the boundless depth of her own courage. That understanding became her most profound takeaway. Heroism was not defined by the absence of fear, but by the resolve to act in spite of it. Over time, Betty's story became legend. Soldiers recounted it to new recruits, nurses shared it in classrooms, and civilians read of it in newspapers. The young nurse from a small town had become a symbol of hope, determination, and humanity in the midst of a world at war. Her name was spoken not only for the life she had saved, but for the enduring inspiration she provided to all who heard her story. As she walked the now quiet corridors of the hospital one final time, Betty paused to take in the scene.
The echoes of battle had faded, replaced by the sounds of healing, footsteps, soft conversations, and the occasional laugh of a recovering soldier. She placed a hand over her heart, feeling the unspoken gratitude of hundreds whose lives she had touched. Her legacy was not only written in reports or medals, but in the survival, hope, and resilience of the men who owed her life to her courage. And in that moment, she understood fully that the bold act she had performed was only part of her story. The real impact was the ripple she had created, through lives saved, inspiration given, and the enduring message that courage, compassion, and resolution could shape the world far beyond a single battlefield. Betty Wilson, the nurse who had faced chaos without hesitation, had become a legend.